The Battle of Rafia was one of those clashes that mark history forever. Nearly 140,000 soldiers collided on the desert plains with war elephants, heavy cavalry, and thousands of spearmen. It was the largest battle ever fought between the heirs of Alexander the Great's empire. This battle decided who would control Syria, one of the richest and most strategic regions in the Mediterranean. It also revealed the first cracks in the system that had dominated the world for nearly a century. The Egyptian victory seemed like a total triumph, but it actually planted the seeds of an internal revolution that almost destroyed the Ptolemaic kingdom. When Alexander the Great died in 323 BC, he was barely 32 years old and had conquered an empire stretching from Greece to India. He had left no clear heir, and his generals wasted no time fighting over the pieces. After decades of wars, the empire was divided into several kingdoms. The most powerful were three: Macedonia in Greece, the Seleucid kingdom spanning from Syria to Afghanistan, and Ptolemaic Egypt. Each of these kingdoms was ruled by Greek or Macedonian dynasties that considered themselves the true heirs of Alexander. The problem was Syria. This region, with its Mediterranean ports, trade routes, and prosperous cities, was too valuable. The Ptolemies wanted it to protect Egypt from the north. The Seleucids needed it to connect their western territories with their eastern ones. Neither could allow the other to control it completely. They had already fought 3 wars over this. The fourth erupted when a young Seleucid king decided it was time to definitively expel the Egyptians from Syria. The June sun beat down hard on the plains of Raphia, near the border between Egypt and Syria. It was 217 BC, and 2 of the most powerful armies in the Mediterranean world were about to clash. On one side marched Ptolemy IV Philopator, the 25-year-old king of Egypt. He wasn't exactly a born warrior. In fact, he preferred banquets and the arts to battlefields. But there he was, mounted on his horse, watching the endless ranks of his troops. He had inherited a rich empire, yes, but also a war that had been dragging on for several years. From the other side came Antiochus III, who already called himself the Great, though he hadn't yet turned 30. This one knew about war. He had spent recent years reconquering lost territories of the Seleucid Empire, and now he wanted to crown his successes by seizing all of Syria and the Mediterranean coast. His ambition knew no bounds, and each victory had convinced him further that he was destined to restore the glory of Alexander's empire. The 2 armies facing each other at Raphia were impressive. Never had such a concentration of Greek military power been seen in one place. Ptolemy had assembled about 70,000 men. Greeks, Macedonians, Egyptians, mercenaries from all over the Mediterranean. His formation followed the classic Macedonian model, with the phalanx as its backbone. Thousands of 6-meter pikes pointing forward, shields gleaming in the sun. The soldiers wore traditional equipment: bronze Corinthian helmets, linen corselets reinforced with metal plates, greaves protecting their shins. Their sarissas, those long pikes that had made the Macedonians famous, swayed to the rhythm of their march. But what really caught the eye were the elephants. Ptolemy had brought 73 of these giants, most of them African, captured in the expeditions his dynasty regularly organized southward, beyond the cataracts of the Nile. The Indian and Nubian mahouts who rode them knew every movement of their beasts. They knew how to direct them toward enemy lines, how to use their weight and terror to break formations. Each elephant carried a wooden tower on its back with archers armed with composite bows, and tusks reinforced with iron points that could pierce the most resistant armor. Antiochus was not to be outdone. His army was perhaps slightly smaller, but he had about 62,000 experienced soldiers. He had brought 102 Indian elephants, larger and more aggressive than the African ones. These giants had been trained specifically for war, raised in military camps since they were young. Their Indian mahouts had spent generations perfecting the art of elephant warfare. The beasts responded to dozens of different commands, could charge in formation, flank the enemy, or retreat in order when necessary. Antiochus's troops included the famous Argyraspides phalanx, with their silver shields that gleamed like mirrors under the desert sun. These elite soldiers wore complete bronze armor, helmets decorated with ostrich plumes and purple cloaks that marked their status. He also had Cretan archers, famous throughout the Mediterranean for their deadly accuracy. Their arrows could pierce any armor at 200 meters. Rhodian slingers complemented the projectile force. With their leather slings, they could launch lead projectiles with threatening inscriptions against the enemy. Antiochus's heavy cataphract cavalry was perhaps his most fearsome weapon. These riders wore armor that covered both man and horse. Mail coats reached to the knees. Helmets had visors that completely protected the face, and 4-meter contos lances could pierce several men with a single thrust. The horses, protected with leather and metal armor, looked like mythical beasts when they charged in formation. For several days, the two armies moved like boxers, studying each other before combat. There were minor skirmishes where small groups of cavalry clashed to test enemy defenses. Reconnaissance parties explored the terrain looking for fords in streams, hills that could serve as observation points, or marshy areas that might hinder elephant movement. The commanders evaluated every detail: wind direction for the archers, sun position that might blind their troops, ground firmness that would determine cavalry effectiveness. Ptolemy positioned his troops following the Macedonian manual: phalanx in the center, cavalry on the flanks, elephants in front. His sister Arsinoe rode among the soldiers, haranguing them with a firm voice. She was a strong-willed woman, and the men respected her. She was also his wife, following the Ptolemaic custom of marriages between siblings to maintain royal bloodline purity. Her presence on the battlefield wasn't merely ceremonial. She knew military tactics and had participated in strategic decisions. "Soldiers of Egypt," she shouted as her horse trotted before the lines. "Today, we fight for the land of the pharaohs, for the riches of the Nile, for the honor of our ancestors. May Alexander guide us to victory." Antiochus deployed his army with more creativity. He placed his heaviest cavalry on the right flank, where he himself planned to lead the charge. It was a risky tactic, but one he had used successfully in previous campaigns. His Indian elephants formed an intimidating line in front of the central phalanx, separated by exact intervals to prevent them from hindering each other in the charge. The archers and slingers were distributed in small groups to provide support where needed, with orders to concentrate their fire on enemy mahouts to disrupt the African elephants. The morning of the battle dawned clear. Both kings made ritual sacrifices to the gods, consulted their soothsayers, delivered the customary speeches. Ptolemy sacrificed a white bull to Zeus, while Antiochus offered incense to Apollo. The soothsayers examined the entrails of the sacrificed animals, looking for favorable signs. The soldiers said goodbye to their companions in case they didn't see each other again, wrote farewell letters which they gave to non-combatants, and reviewed their wills one last time. The morning air carried the aroma of sacrifices, mixed with the smell of leather, metal, and sweat from thousands of nervous men. The horses pawed restlessly, sensing the tension. The elephants swayed their trunks, some nervously sweeping the ground. The combat began, as was traditional, with the clash of elephants. 175 of these beasts ran toward each other, raising clouds of dust that darkened the battlefield. The noise was deafening. The trumpeting of the animals, the shouts of mahouts in a dozen different languages, the thunder of gigantic bodies colliding like moving mountains. Antiochus's Indian elephants had the advantage of size and experience. Several of Ptolemy's African elephants retreated, frightened by the strange smell of their Asian cousins, turned and ran toward their own lines, trampling soldiers who couldn't get out of the way in time. It was the classic problem with these animals. When they got scared, they couldn't distinguish between friends and enemies. Their steps left deep tracks in the sand, and more than one unfortunate soldier ended up crushed under tons of flesh and bone. But the Ptolemaic mahouts were veterans who had learned their trade in previous wars. They knew how to control their beasts even in panic, using specific voice commands and the ankus, that iron-pointed staff that directed the animal by touching sensitive spots behind the ears. They managed to regroup most of their elephants and keep the line relatively stable. Antiochus's advantage wasn't as decisive as he had hoped. Then the real battle began. Antiochus, seeing that his elephants hadn't completely broken enemy lines, decided to take the initiative on the right flank. He spurred his horse and charged at the head of his heavy cataphract cavalry, his purple cloak flowing behind him like a war banner. It was a breathtaking spectacle. Hundreds of armored riders galloping in tight formation, lances pointing forward like a deadly forest of iron points, the ground trembling under the horses' hooves as if it were an earthquake. The sun reflected off their armor, creating blinding flashes. The Ptolemaic forces tried to resist by forming a shield wall, but the charge was devastating. The Egyptian cavalry crumbled like sand before the sea. The riders who could escape fled toward the rear, closely pursued by Antiochus and his men. Some tried to regroup behind the infantry, but panic was contagious. The Seleucid king was euphoric, blood running hot through his veins after breaking through enemy lines. "The battle is ours!" he shouted to his officers as he galloped after the fugitives, his sword dripping blood. But he had made the classic mistake of the impetuous commander. He had strayed too far from the main battlefield, taking his best troops with him just when he needed them most. Meanwhile, in the center, things weren't going as he expected. The Ptolemaic phalanx had resisted the initial elephant charge and was now pressing forward with the mechanical discipline that had made the Macedonians famous. The Egyptian sarissophores, with their 6-meter pikes, maintained a constant disciplined rhythm. One step, plant the pike; another step, push. Their shields interlocked like the scales of a giant serpent, creating an impenetrable wall of bronze and iron. Ptolemy, though not a natural warrior, had surrounded himself with experienced commanders who had served his father. His general Sosibius coordinated movements from the center, mounted on a white horse that made him visible to messengers. Other officers directed auxiliary troops to exploit any breach in Seleucid lines, sending reinforcements where pressure was greatest, and withdrawing damaged units before they could collapse completely. The decisive moment came when the Ptolemaic phalanx managed to break the Seleucid center. Without Antiochus and his cavalry for support, the center troops couldn't resist the constant pressure of thousands of spear points pushing forward. The Seleucid soldiers, many of them mercenaries without the iron discipline of Macedonian veterans, began to give ground. First, it was a few meters, with men retreating step by step while maintaining formation. Then more, when some soldiers stumbled and created gaps in the line. Finally, the line broke like a bursting dam, and panic spread like fire in dry grass. The Seleucid soldiers began retreating in disorder. At first, it was an organized withdrawal, with officers shouting orders and trying to keep their men in formation. But when they saw their king had disappeared chasing the enemy cavalry, panic spread. Was Antiochus dead? Had he abandoned them? Was this another of the betrayals that had bled the empire dry for decades? Rumors ran faster than horses. One soldier shouted that he had seen the king fall. Another swore he had fled the battlefield. In the confusion, nobody knew what to believe. The Ptolemaic forces took advantage of the situation to intensify their attack, their trumpets sounding the general charge. When Antiochus finally returned from his victorious pursuit, with loose reins and a triumphant smile on his lips, he found a nightmare scene. His army was disintegrating before his eyes. His best troops were fleeing northward, leaving behind weapons, baggage, wounded. The battlefield was covered with corpses in Seleucid colors, and vultures were already beginning to descend in lazy circles. "Regroup! The battle isn't over," he shouted, but it was too late. His voice was lost in the chaos. The Ptolemaic forces had already taken control of the field. Their troops pursued the fugitives, gathered prisoners to sell as slaves, looted the Seleucid camp where they found enough gold to pay the entire army for months. Ptolemy IV had won his first major battle, and what a battle it was. The casualties were enormous. Ancient historians speak of more than 10,000 Seleucid dead and nearly 500 Ptolemaic, though these figures are probably exaggerated as was customary in chronicles of the era. What is clear is that it was carnage that was remembered for generations. Raphia became synonymous with devastation in the Hellenistic world. Antiochus managed to escape with part of his army, but had to abandon all his conquests in southern Syria. The cities he had taken quickly returned to Ptolemaic control, opening their gates to Egyptian garrisons that arrived a few weeks later. His dream of definitively expelling the Egyptians from Syria would have to wait another generation. For Ptolemy IV, the victory should have been the culminating moment of his reign. He had defeated the great Antiochus, recovered important territories, proven that Egypt remained a first-rate power. The celebrations in Alexandria lasted for weeks, with processions, banquets, and games in the hippodrome. Commemorative coins were minted, showing the victorious king trampling his enemies. But the victory brought unexpected consequences that no soothsayer had foreseen. The army that had won at Raphia included for the first time a significant number of native Egyptian soldiers. These men had fought alongside Greeks and Macedonians, had proven their worth under the desert's relentless sun, had shed their blood for the Ptolemaic kingdom. Now they expected rewards, recognition, perhaps even participation in the government their ancestors had lost 3 centuries earlier. Ptolemy IV and his court, dominated by Greeks and Macedonians who looked upon Egyptians as second-class subjects, weren't prepared for these changes. They treated the Egyptian veterans the same as before, like peasants who had been lucky enough to survive a battle. They paid their wages, gave them their discharges, and expected them to return docilely to their fields and workshops. Tension grew rapidly. The veterans talked among themselves in markets, in temples, in delta taverns. They had seen Greeks and Macedonians die just like them. They had seen that courage and strength didn't depend on skin color or place of birth. Why then continue being second-class citizens in their own land? A few years after Raphia, the revolts that marked the beginning of the end of Ptolemaic power began. The Egyptians of Upper Egypt rose against the government of Alexandria and established their own independent kingdom in the south, with its capital in Thebes. It wasn't a simple rebellion of slaves or desperate peasants, but an organized revolution that almost finished off the Ptolemaic dynasty. The rebels went so far as to crown their own pharaohs, minted coins with traditional hieroglyphs, controlled territories that included some of Egypt's richest cities. They established a government system that mixed ancient Egyptian traditions with administrative innovations learned from their former Greek masters. The civil war that followed lasted more than 20 years and consumed the resources Ptolemy had gained at Raphia. When they were finally defeated in 1850 BC, the Ptolemaic government applied the classic Egyptian solution for dealing with successful rebellions: erase from history any trace that anything had happened. They destroyed inscriptions, scraped names from monuments, burned documents, executed historians who might have recorded the events. They wanted it to appear that an independent Egyptian kingdom had never existed. But the damage was already done. Egypt never again became the power it had been before Raphia. The victory that should have consolidated Ptolemaic power ended up being the beginning of its slow but inexorable decline. Antiochus III, for his part, recovered from defeat with the determination that had made him famous. He turned his attention eastward, where he conquered territories in Central Asia and reached the borders of India, following in Alexander's footsteps. He truly earned the title the Great with these eastern campaigns, restoring Seleucid prestige and filling the royal coffers with tribute from dozens of subjugated peoples. But when he finally decided to confront Rome years later, he discovered there were much more dangerous rivals than the Ptolemies. The Romans didn't fight just for glory or territory, but for the survival of their way of life, and they had practically unlimited resources to sustain long wars. The Battle of Rafia marked the end of an era. It was the last great clash between the direct heirs of Alexander the Great, the swan song of the independent Hellenistic world. After Raphia, Rome began to intervene more and more in Eastern Mediterranean affairs, first as arbitrator, then as protector, finally as conqueror. On the plains where the battle had been fought, the bones of fallen soldiers mixed with desert sand. Weapons rusted under sporadic rains, helmets filled with wind-blown earth, shields cracked under the relentless sun. But the story of Raphia lived on in historians' chronicles, a reminder that even the most brilliant victories can carry within them the seeds of defeat.